Hello, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. Pretty quick intro from me today because me and Andrea are getting to detail about what we're looking at, but we're looking at Lee Lozano, the painter. We're looking at her wave paintings, this series of paintings she made in the late 60s, and we're looking at her wider work across the 60s and 70s, including her kind of art life pieces where she intervened in daily life. As always, the PDFs are downloadable via dekersaint.com/bad vibes club. That's dekersaint.com/bad vibes club, all one word. We looked at Lee Lozano's notebooks, I made a PDF of an excerpt of her notebooks. The book is called Lee Lozano Notebooks 1967 to 70. And it's published in 2009, I think, by Primary Information. The other thing we're looking at is, really in-depth study of Lee Lozano's work by Jo Applin. And we're looking at one chapter which we've included, which is called Abrupt Terminations. And finally, as a kind of helpful and interesting appendix to this episode, we're looking at another painter's writing, a letter to the editor by Jo Baer, which was published in Artforum in 1967, which is a kind of riposte to the minimalists who were kind of lauding sculpture as the only way forward. And she's kind of making a claim for painting in that letter. And it's just really fun little bit of additional research that Andrea found. I imagine that if you're listening to this episode, you listen to the Bad Vibes Club or the 10 Text series in general, and I would strongly encourage you to follow the show, to like it, to click a little star button and to give us a little rating, and maybe even to give us a comment on one of these apps that gives you podcasts, and tell us what you love about the show. It helps. And obviously pass it on. If you think it's of use to you, then maybe it's of use to someone else. All right, see you at the end. Bye. Welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. My name is Matthew de Kersaint-Giraudot.
And I'm Andrea Franke.
Today, we are looking at the practice of Lee Lozano, who was an American US artist. And we're going to look at the work she was making in the late 60s. She's got quite a complex career, and the timeline is, probably important. But we'll get into that later. And we're looking at 3 texts, really, maybe with some supplementary things that, Andrea, I think you're going to bring in. So the thing that I've brought is an excerpt from her notebooks, which the publication that I found was from her notebooks from 1967 to 1970, I think, which is over the period of time she was making her, what's been called her masterpiece, which is the wave paintings, and also started doing these kind of art life pieces, which are maybe, again, we can get into what those are, but they're kind of interventions into everyday life or something, or an attempt to mix art and life. And then what are the things that you brought, Andrea?
So I bought Lee Lozano Not Working, which is a book by Jo Applin, and we're looking at the chapter 2, Abrupt Terminations, which is the chapter that looks at the waves. And Jo Applin is based at the Courtauld, so I'm just going to give a shout out to the Courtauld because they has such a great team now. We've been reading, I read like Mignon Nixon last year, and Catherine Grant is there. So I think it's a really interesting institution right now. And then in that text, she mentioned this text by Jo Baer, who was a painter and is painting in a similar time, Lozano. So she's kind of like facing similar issues. And she wrote a letter to Artforum in September 1967. That is the most incredible piece of writing. So we're going to look at that as well.
All right. So we were just saying we're both over and under prepared. Do you want to explain what that means for you? And then I'll explain what that means for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I've read so much stuff, and I was saying like I listened to like the discussions, and I read so many books. I got every book that the library had on Lozano, and I still feel kind of lost about how to talk about it. And I think maybe this is interesting because it goes to this point where it's the thing that we talked from the beginning, which is like painting is so hard to talk about, and it would be so easy to talk about Lozano as a career. And I think that's what happens a lot. People just go to the dropout pieces or to other things that are like really easy to have a hold on. But we decided to talk about the paintings, a very specific series of paintings. And I think it's quite hard. So it's not that I feel underprepared, because in a way I read more about this than I've read about any of the other episodes that we've done. It's just that I find really hard to find a place to hold or to feel that I have a ground to talk from. But I think that's what's going to be interesting for it to be a conversation.
Well, okay, mine is much more straightforward than that, in the sense that Andrea sent me the Jo Applin chapter earlier this week, and I haven't finished it. So that's how I'm underprepared. So what we'll probably have to do is that we'll talk through these texts, but then Andrea, you might have to kind of take over when it comes to the Jo Applin. Or maybe I'll just say that we kind of both feel like we have different reasons why we're doing this podcast. Mine was that I knew Lee Lozano before we were doing this podcast, mainly for her, I guess I was calling them performance pieces. They're not really performance pieces. She never called it performance. She called them just pieces. And they were like interventions in her daily life, almost experiments. So there's a grass piece where she smokes weed every day for like how many days and kind of documents its effect. There's a masturbation piece that I was just reading about in the Jo Applin text, where she masturbates in different ways and kind of notes the different experiences. And then famously, towards the end of her kind of New York career, there are two very big, quite provocative pieces. One, I can't remember, what's the one where she stops talking to women? What's that called? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay. It's basically she stopped speaking to women. And she really does seem to carry that out more or less for the rest of her life. Oh yeah, the boycott women, decide to boycott women. And then the very famous piece, which I think that's the After All book, isn't it? It's called Dropout Piece. So there's a whole book on Dropout Piece that published by After All, which I did read, which she kind of claims that she stopped, she's going to stop going to openings, stop participating in the art world, stop speaking to people. And again, in different ways, which is quite complex, that does happen. She moves away from New York and ends up living at home with her parents. And then there's a complex thing at the end of her life where she's living in the same town as her parents, but her parents take out a restraining order on her. Anyway, so kind of interesting biography towards the end of her life. So with lots of mental health issues. But in the 60s, she was also doing quite amazing paintings. And she changed her style like really radically. So when I started seeing the paintings, I can't remember why they popped up, probably because I was reading the Artforum book. I was like, oh, these are great. And then I realized that she'd written loads about paintings in the same notebooks where she'd written about the pieces that, the Dropout piece and the Boycott Women piece. So that's my starting point, was that I realized that she'd done all this amazing writing. And we'll talk about what's in the notebooks, but like lots of diagrams, lots of little, very like detailed reflections or plans for these paintings. So I was like, wow, this is perfect for the painting podcast. But you had a different starting point.
Yeah. So, I think I heard sort of Lozano because Jill Allison, who teaches with me at Chelsea, she's kind of like all her research is about refusal. And so Lozano is like a really, really big figure for her. So she always talks about Lozano as being one of her heroes. And then at the same time, I think like 2 years ago, I had a student who was doing something about drawing and exhaustion and the limits of the body. And at the same time, I was reading this text, which is not one of the texts that we're reading today, but it's a text that is talking about Lucy Lippard's novel and the wave paintings. And it's talking about that kind of like relationship between the body and painting, which is quite specific of how painting has a relation to the limit of what the human can do in a way that is not necessarily that maybe like some performance, like duration performance will have it, but it's not necessarily present in other mediums. So when we're right at the beginning, when we decided we were going to do something about like series on paintings, I was like, I want to do something about that sort of like relationship between what the body can do and how kind of like painting deals with that. And then if it's okay, there's like some like general tone, like notes that I put about like general things that I would like to think about in relation to those paintings specific. And then maybe like if I put them out now, then we can see how they appear. So one of them is how, and this comes from like a discussion when there was a show about Lozano, the Hazard on Wirth. So it's Jutta Kudner, who's like an abstract painter. So she uses the term that Lozano is interested in the internal procedures of painting, and that's why her work is kind of like so interesting, so influential still. That and for her, the internal procedures of paintings are not just like the tensions in between colors or areas, but it's also about like impairment, like physical impairment. So exhaustion, but also she's always painting high or like on drugs. There's all these different ways she registered that, and also the social scenarios of the time. So she kind of like expands what the internal procedures of paintings are in relation to like conceptualism. The other thing that I think is really interesting is she has this like 10-year career in like this moment of change in like the US scene where like, everybody's looking at sculpture. That's why like, Bartex comes. All her friends are sculptors and performers, and she's stubbornly doing painting. And there's something about that kind of like relation between abstraction, minimalism, and conceptualism. And she goes through all these things, but she goes through them through painting while everybody else seems to be going through them through sculpture and performance, which I think is really interesting. And then there's something about, and this comes in the After All book, which she openly says that she makes work that resist reproduction. And I've never seen the wave paintings, which is, I think, one of the things that is really hard to talk about them, because the photos of the wave paintings are so bad. Always. You never get what they are. And then in the After All book, what they're saying is that Lozano wanted to make paintings that can only be seen. They cannot be reproduced and they cannot be described verbally. They're objects that you have to experience firsthand. And like currently I'm obsessed with like people that do uninstagrammable work or like curate uninstagrammable shows. And it's like, how can you do work at this moment in time that cannot be captured? Like, how can you do work that doesn't feed AI data sets and bots? And I think we're living at like a very specific moment of rejection of those things. And in that sense, there's something really exciting about Lozano taking that stand in like the late 60s and saying like, I want to do, she moves from her early paintings in the early 60s are very reproducible. They're amazing. And you look at them on books and you fall in love with them. And like the waves are such a puzzle, because there are all these different descriptions and people are like, oh, but light reacts in this different way and this happens and this. And you're like, but I don't know because I can't see them. So I think that's something that I'm really interested in too as well.
All right, great. Should we get into it then? So where's a good place to start? Maybe the notebooks we can refer to more generally. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should just go into the Applin. Where do you want to start with that?
I mean, I had lots of like highlighted notes, so I don't know if you just want to go in order and go through.
Yeah, well, why don't you lead on it? Because like I said, I didn't finish it, so therefore I can't kind of join everything back up. I just got to the bit where they started talking about, abstraction and feminism as kind of parallel ways of operating for Lozano, or in relation to Lozano. So maybe you lead us through, and I'll jump in when I'm reminded of something or what.
So maybe like I start with the series of like names of her work, which is a really great. Like Applin's kind of she's kind of setting the scene when she's like, well, like Lozano best friends are like
Sarah.
No, well, not Sarah. Sarah does the verse, but is Carl Andre? No, it's not Carl Andre. It's the other.
Carl Andre, yeah,
Carl Andre, yeah. So she's hanging out with all these sculptures, and I think she's trying to like position what it is to have this painter who's hanging out with also all these dudes always, but all these sculpture dudes. And she's talking about the names of her paintings in relation to Richard Serra's list of verbs. And I thought it was something interesting to come back, because when we talk about Philida Barlow and her choice of words, and there's something about like, what these kind of like actions mean. So the paintings that Lozano did from 65 are called, or include, the names include clamp, crook, pitch, cleave, lean, split, hack, shoot, slide, goad, clash, swap, butt, and stroke.
And also ream and peel. Well, I was just going to say that just to describe these paintings, these are, she'd been doing these kind of like lumpy, semi-realistic depictions of actual tools like hammers and clamps and things. And then by the time she's using these tiles, they're kind of slid into things that are much more formal. If they're, they kind of are reminiscent of the shapes of tools, and they're very strange paintings and really quite amazing. And they're made over multiple canvases, and so the shapes go over these multiple canvases, but the style of painting changes on the canvases. So you have like, a kind of cone going across two canvases, but the cone is totally flat, and then suddenly has this illusion of depth on the next canvas. They're quite amazing paintings.
Yeah, and they have these little holes, like moth holes, which are incredible.
Yeah, they have little holes cut in, so sometimes you can see the stretcher bar at the back. And I think
Applin is comparing this to Richard Serra's list of words, which he I'm gonna see, it's from 67, which are words like to roll, to crease, to fold, to store, to bend, to crumple, to cut, to split, to drop. And what she's saying is like, Lozano is like bringing this weird, like hypersexual sense of humor to this kind of completely different, very dry, minimalist. Those dudes are so serious. They're so and I love it. I just love and it's in all the work, and I think we're gonna see it in the waves as well. But there's like a sensuality and a sexuality and embodiness, and a sense of humor and a tone to Lozano work that is quite incredible. And I think it permeates all her writing and all her thinking and all her, and it's just again, I think it's very weird at that time and in painting.
I think it's amazing. So her list of titles of paintings, like you say, ream, spin, veer, span, cross. And then she writes at the top, all verbs. And then Richard Serra's piece, text piece or whatever you call it, is named verb list. And hers are kind of quite wild and span straightforward verbs, actions you might do to material, to things that clearly have a kind of sexual undertone. Applin calls them a psychosexual undertone. Whereas Serra's lists seems now, it's very famous and is used quite a lot. I was working with a teacher the other day and we did something using it. But it makes it seem really dry and really boring because it's all actual things that you can do to actual material.
It's so boring. Sarah is so boring. We should all get over Sarah. I know he passed away.
He's doing at the time. But, comparing like to roll, to crease, to fold, to store, to ream, spin, veer, span, cross, ram, peel, there's a totally different charge to it, isn't it? But they're both, the point being, I suppose, is that it is a time when people are thinking about process as maybe like a very central experience in art making.
No, but I'm gonna embrace the Lozano in me. And I'm gonna say there's a reason why certain practices get canonized and others not, and other gets rediscovered. And I think there's a time to question why those guys doing like this really serious, quite pretentious, boring. I mean, Sarah, if we're thinking about the body, Sarah is such an inhuman artist, right? People get hurt doing his work. That's how inhuman, his work is. And what does it mean to canonize Sarah and keep working with that list of verbs instead of working with like Lozano words? I think like those are the choices that we have to make now and kind of like take ownership of like, we don't have to keep reproducing the canon as it is. There's like a history of why that canon was constructed as it is. And I think there's like an incredible potential to challenge that canon. So I say, stop using Sarah's words from now on and start using Lozano's words.
You know what? And I'm going to say this because I think it's really relevant. And I will use this list of verbs actually now. I'll probably use it alongside Sarah. And just to defend Sarah, I don't know why I need to defend Richard Serra, but the work he's making around that time is very embodied, and it does include, it's his body, so it's the body of the status quo of a man, but it is very embodied, and it's him doing the dangerous things to the materials rather than there's later works where people keep getting crushed by big bits of metal. But anyway, the point is, I think it's because I was doing some teaching with another teacher, and she made like a kind of what would be the phrase, like a joke that had sexual undertones, and I was like shocked and both like really happy that she'd done it, because we were doing in a crit or something, we were talking about students' work, and she brought in something really clear that was in the work that I just really didn't know how to articulate, because I'm a middle-aged man and lots of my students are younger women, and so I just wouldn't have known how to do it. And so I think that's partly why what happens, all the dry stuff comes through, because like what gets taught, it gets a bit scary to start talking about stuff that is like if I say ream to my students and I imply that I know what reaming is, like it just becomes a bit like, how do I position myself in relation to that? I don't know. That seems really simple, but
I don't know. I think it's something to be worked through, right? Because otherwise, then again, like if people are afraid to bring like race into the classroom and have to, then you start like not having like it reproduces because it is bland. You know what I mean? Yeah. Sarah's work is bland. It's really easy to talk about it. Like, but if you want to talk about like Adrian Piper, if you want to talk about like Lozano, if you want to talk about all these other people that were doing work at the time, then that gets complicated, because that is really complex work that touches in a lot of like weird. So I think there's something there.
I think there is definitely something
keep pushing you.
Yeah, no, I really like it, and I think it's really important. I think exactly what you're saying, but I'm happy is not the right word, but I feel like it's crazy not to mention race or class or gender when I'm teaching, because I'm there. I'm right there. You can see I'm white. You can see I'm a man. You can see I'm middle-aged. I must be middle class in some form because I'm teaching, but I have, like everyone, have a complex background in relation to that. So I can talk through that stuff. But to talk about, I don't know, to recognize that you have a sex life is a very different thing. It's a different kind of body that's being revealed there. So yeah, I haven't found a way to stick that.
I'll ask you in a year when we do it.
But Lozano's amazing for that because, and this is what's amazing about the practice, right, is that she's doing these paintings at the same time as she's doing these other kind of art life pieces. And then the paintings themselves have this like she doesn't see a split necessarily, although she does talk a lot about painting and maybe giving up painting or whatever. Painting has is meaningfully different to her. But like, they're both like, as you say, like all of these things are embodied. And when she shifts from making images of these tools to making images of these kind of grinding abstract shapes, they're still just as charged and kind of explicit and sexual to her, even though they're not literally images of, she was painting images of like genitals and naked bodies and stuff before.
So Applin is starting to talk about the waves. And there's this thing, so the last painting of, it's not really clear to me because it's always like the last painting of the wave took 52 hours. But that's the one that is 96. And there's this one that comes afterwards that is a bit weird. And I don't understand why. I don't know. There's something weird also about the way that people talk about her work, that it kind of like slips. And we're going to talk about things that, for example, you read in one text and no one else talks about it. And he's like, why this part of the work has never talked about it? So there's something about her work that is always like, there's a slippage to the way people talk about her work. But there's this thing. So the waves are like really conceptual and cerebral and have this scientific idea. So she's kind of like, but it's kind of like interpreted in this very like intuitive way. And she's always, as you say in the notebook, she's always coming up with these rules and ways of making. So there's this conceptual undertone to the process of painting. And she kind of like makes this decision that she has to make each one of those paintings in one sitting. And the last one takes 52 hours. And that's sort of where the series stops. And that's where the thing about the limits of the body comes. But this idea that she come to the limit of what her body could produce, because she could not, she went like those 52 hours without sleeping. So she can't go more than those like 2 and a bit days of not sleeping and painting. And I was thinking that's something that is really interesting to me, is that connection between like the conceptual and the kind of like durational limitations of the body. And it made me think of, and Lozano would be very annoyed at me because I think she has a very tense relationship with feminism, which is totally, there's lots of ways to articulate that. But it made me think about about Helena Recchi talking about relational aesthetics and the history of relational aesthetics and why relational aesthetics, becomes this massive concept in comparison to the women or the feminist work that was being done in relation to that very similar types of practice that involve hosting and social practice and things like that. And it was because, or Recchi is saying that one of the reasons is because those practices were so interested in maintenance and production and thinking about the bodies that makes the work, while relational aesthetics completely erases that. And it's like, who's doing the washing up after, like, who cares? That doesn't matter. Well, like feminist work was always interested in like the whole process of like construction, production and maintenance, and who is doing the production and maintenance, and what is the body and what is the cost of the body and what are the limits of that body. And I think there's something really interesting about the waves and that kind of like internal part of the production of doing something that is so conceptual. And if you think about, people that are doing conceptual painting at the time, but at the same time, her body is so present, and that thing about the 52 hours is there in the press release. The press release is all about the Whitney, and I have the press release, I made a copy of it, but the Whitney, so the ways were exhibited at the Whitney write this press release that is all about like, this work and the energy and all these things. And she kind of like crosses that over and she's like, this painting took 52 hours. This painting took this amount of time. So there's something about like unveiling this invisible labor of the body in the studio and the costs of being a painter, because I think that comes across as well in like the drugs and, the effect that practice takes on her. That is so, I would say in terms of minimalism, is so distasteful. And it's kind of like, I think it's been exploring some like performance stuff that is happening at the time, but it's not been exploring that sort of practice that so she's kind of like confusing all the borders of like, where are the places where you're supposed to be talking about each thing in a way?
Yeah, I mean, and that maybe, she was she's right in the heart of the New York art world in the 60s. It's not like she's a peripheral figure.
She knows everybody. Her dialogue piece is like everybody that was someone in New York at the time has a chat with her.
Yeah, which, I mean, she's in, is it Max's? Was that the bar? Anyway, she's in the bar with Sarah and Dan Graham and Carl Andre, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, like, she's not canonized in the same way. I mean, she is very, very famous now, and there's lots and lots written about her, hence why we can have this podcast. But yes, it's very strange. I mean, what I've found really fascinating was the way that it is very conceptual, the Wave series, but it's very impure, because so that's the point, right? Is that she's happy to talk about both the arbitrary part of it, in the sense that all the waves are based on the size of the canvas, but the size of the canvas happens to be 96 inches, but we don't know, that's never explained like why. So then all the titling and everything flows from this size. But then there's all this stuff about brushes, which obviously like the sculptors would never have liked, about like using the same size brush. And then there's this other element, which is like something that's a waves as a metaphor, or her interest in like the cosmic, or the spiritual elements of science that goes beyond the known. So she copies out this wave diagram, which is in the Applin, about cosmic rays and infrared rays and stuff. And she writes at the top of it something just like metaphor or something. So she knows that she's operating in the metaphorical, which is obviously, again, the opposite of the literalism or the kind of literal materialism that lots of the sculptors are espousing at this time. So she's kind of, she's not doing it by mistake, but she's like messing it all up. All this stuff that they're trying to lay out, she's kind of mucking it all about. Firstly, by being a painter at all. Secondly, by being a woman, right? Just necessarily. And thirdly, by allowing those things to kind of go back and forth across the different works she's making and across the way she's thinking about the pieces as well. I was just going to say about taste, and I think taste is what's really documented really interestingly, an intuition in the notebooks, where she often will draw out potential paintings, and there's a few pages where she has multiple options for paintings, some of which end up in the Wave series, some of which end up in other series, lots of which just don't end up in any series, because because she just writes in capital letters no next to it. And that is how she makes a decision, right? She crosses things out, or she writes no, or she says, oh, I hate it. She writes a little note later on to herself. You see where she just decides whether she likes something or not, which is really important. Like, to note that like lots of these decisions are taste decisions, which aren't, not necessarily totally explicable in kind of, whatever, rational terms or procedural terms or whatever. And then also there's a really interesting one in the pages I sent you about this embodied painting, these long painting sessions. She has a little sketch of something, and then written next to it, it's a potential painting, like a potential wave painting. She writes, a dismal attempt at method correction to eliminate 10-hour painting sessions. And then she says, in a note, on April 30th, I had a 12-hour painting session. But then below it, she writes, I cannot do this corny strike thing ever, which is, they look like strike waves. So she decides, no, she can't do it. And then later on, she writes, oh yeah, note to myself, so what if there are 10-hour painting sessions? You can do it, which is kind of like, yeah, like endurance. But then after that, she writes, it's easier when the canvas is at a proper height. Get more horses. So it's this, what an amazing page, right? So first you have like a plan for a painting that's based on like cosmic rays. And then you have this thing of like, oh, but should we just try and do it so it doesn't like, totally burn you out from doing these long sessions? And then you have like, yes, you have to do these. It's part of it. Doing these endurance painting sessions is really important. And then like a little minor thing of like, but it is also easier if you do it with this very practical adjustment of making the paintings at the right height. And that is how, just speaking personally, that is all the things you're thinking about when you're making a painting are all mashed together like that. But you're totally right. Like if you read a Bob Morris, it's very much like all of those other things are kind of pushed to the side, aren't they? And you get this, or the Sarah Verbalist is very like, this kind of illusion of purity is maintained. Sorry, I actually interrupted you. So do you remember what you were going to say?
Oh yeah, no, I remember what I was going to say. I was going to go back to the Richard Serra again, but no, I'm not to annoy you, but because I was thinking about when we did the Duchamp episode, we were reading this Helena Molesworth, and she had this amazing thing where she said, what if instead of like taking for granted the history of sculpture that, it goes to the plane to the floor, what if the sculpture went from the plane to the table? And what if we hold like this sculpture as kind of like the origin of all this evolution? And I think that's the thing that is interesting to me. There was something I thought so much about our episode on minimalism reading this thing, because I was like, what would have been the episode if we knew Lozano's work? And like, what does it mean? Yeah, like what the people that you choose to be, the kind of like, or the work that you choose to be at the center of this kind of timelines that we all construct through art, they kind of like dictate what are the things that we pay attention to or not. Oh, wow. And it was like, I didn't thought about, I didn't thought about the erasure of the human labor of the body in that sense when I was looking at those works, in the sense that now I'm hyper aware of. So it has been really interesting to like, because the letter that Baer writes to Artforum is in response to Donald Judd and Robert Morris. And it's in 67. It's exactly at the time we were reading all these things and doing minimalism. Yeah. And she's like this angry voice. And I was like, isn't it a shame that we didn't read that at the time? That there was like this angry person that was like articulating and calling out all these different things. It's like, you guys are saying all these things, but this is actually completely empty. And he's like, this is a really good point.
Well, I was thinking about that actually, because maybe just before the question I'm going to ask you at the end of this is, can you just outline who Jo Baer is and why we're talking about her? But before that, I was reading this and I was thinking, it's so fascinating that this letter is not mentioned loads. This is the first time I've read it, but yeah, it would have been a really brilliant thing to have when we were doing our episode on that kind of era of sculpture. But what's really weird is that everyone at the time who was invested in that discourse would have read it. And it would have been really, it would have been part of the discussion, because it was a letter in Artforum explicitly responding to this Artforum piece. So like all those people who are involved, they aren't like ignoring it. Presumably this is part of like the discussion. So it's really weird how it's like, sometimes we talk about, whatever, Sarah, today we given Sarah a hard time. That's totally fine. I don't need to be in the position of defending Sarah, as I said. But it is funny how like, these conversations would have been being had by people like Sarah. Yeah, who knows what the terms were, but they were. Jo Baer is clearly part of the discussion because she's in Artforum. A letter to the editor rather than an editorial. But I don't know. It's just kind of. It's almost like it's just really weird to think of yourself like all you would have had to do is go to the archive and find the issue of Artforum and flick through the whole thing, or like flick through a few issues around it, and we would have found it in the first place. But that's scholarship, isn't it? That's the difference between kind of what we're doing and then which is like stumbling through text and maybe something like real scholarship where you really pay attention to how things were coming into the culture at the time and not just like trying to find your way back and trying to kind of critically examine things. I don't know, that's a bit of a messy point, but I just think it's fascinating to think like of those real conversations were probably happening on Max's part or whatever.
I think it's a very good point as well in terms of for like students who are doing research, for example, because I just did this session about like we're kind of trying to figure out how to deal with AI and stuff, and just like telling my students, please don't read summaries, like because when you read a summary, you're missing out all these different things. And one of the interesting things about like reading all these different books on Lozano is that these are completely different perspectives, right? So like the Dropout piece is such a biographical focused piece. It's like so focused. It's also very dramatic and it's about sort of like trauma and addiction. And it has like all this mental health undertones or her like, like romantic relationships. It's very personal. And then the Jo Applin thing had all these really weird things. Like, for example, like Jo Baer has a very strong presence in this because like Baer is someone who's painting and that Lozano actually admires and get involved with, and in a way Baer is having similar fights for Lozano, but Baer is getting a lot better reviews than Lozano, and she's trying to understand why at the time. And again, she has like this really, I'm gonna just maybe like this is a good place to mention, but this description that I hadn't found anywhere else, which is that Lozano does exhibit her series of waves, and she exhibits them under Whitney, and everybody describes this as a black painted room. The paintings are higher than they should be, which I think is also like a theatricality thing, and we can talk about that you have to move the body and you have to look them up. They are lit in a very specific way. It's a very specific room, and everybody describes that as being like quite an amazing thing, and the paintings react to light in a very specific thing. But then Applin said there's a room next to it, and this room has this little boxes with like nail clippings and stuff that Lozano grabbed from her bathroom floor. And he's like, why is this in none of the other like 10 books that I read that had this?
Totally.
This seems like a massively important thing. And again, an Applin is like, look, this review talks about this review. So she found lots of reviews at the time that mention it. So at the time when the piece was covered, these things were mentioned. And at some point when it has been historicized, the After All book doesn't mention it. The other like 5 books, none of them mention that. And to me, it's just mind-boggling. But those are the things that if you ask AI for a summary of the wave painting, those are the things that you will never accidentally encounter, because you're having like this, I don't know, this like mix of like all the average positions on like this work that have existed. And you miss this thing that is a really fun thing, which is like, oh my God, these people have such a different way of reading this work. And not only reading it, but like this, the things that they're paying attention to and then they're telling us are completely different. And you get a lot of those tensions. So I think the letter is the same, right? It's like Jo Applin just went and found this. And I just like, she mentions it. And then I was like, I want to read this letter because I, had my face of being completely in love with Robert Morris. And it is a response to Robert Morris in a sense. And I don't know if we want to talk about, maybe we can talk about the letter now. This is the moment when the letter enters in Applin text now. But I just wrote, this is really ridiculous for me, but I just wrote, my queen, like Tony's everything. This is like the most incredible. I highlighted like almost everything because I just couldn't stop. I was like, this is such an incredibly angry in a way that allows it to be angry, but also like incredibly well articulated. It's so cranky. This is how I would like my crankiness to be, because it's a crankiness that is so sophisticated and it's full of burns, and the burns are so precise and excellent.
It's a defense of painting. It's a defense against Robert Morris's dismissal of painting in Notes on Sculpture Part 3, which was published in Artforum in 1967. So presumably this is the next issue of Artforum. Oh yeah, September 1967. And she just takes him to task, and then she brings Judd in and says that he's talking shit as well. And she just she's, I guess in a way, she's doing a very straightforward thing, which is saying like, yeah, like painting is still doing all of these things that you're trying to do. And it actually has been, if you think about it in this way, it's been doing it much longer than sculpture's been doing it. But yes, she's really good. I like how she calls him Bob Morris as well, so she obviously must know her.
Yeah, for sure they're all friends. I mean, you can't be, I would think you'll be like publicly cranky at someone in our forum if they're not, this is the way that I'm cranky with you when you talk about Richard Serra. You have to have a certain level of intimacy to be.
I love that. It's like I'm a massive fan of Richard Serra now. It's really good. I like this. This is how history is going to judge me after it. Matthew de Coursaint-Girardot, huge fan of Richard Serra.
And it's like, I don't know, it's like, it's just, I have so many. And it's also like, it's not only defending painting, but it's taking down minimalist sculpture in a way that now makes so much sense. Because at the time, they're posing this thing as this kind of like heroic, radical, completely original thing. And she's like, well, are you really? Is this really what it happens? And her whole point is about illusion. So there's this word that sculptors like Morris and Judd are using at the time. And it also comes up in all the critiques of the wave paintings and all the critiques of, painting at the time, which comes, I'm guessing, from Clement Greenberg. But it's this idea that painting can't be separated from illusion, and sculpture can do this other thing that doesn't have.
Yeah, the idea that there's always the implication of an external reference for painting, and that sculpture can, the critics' term for it, the critical term for it was literalism. It can be the things that it is. It can be the materials that it's made out of, rather than referring to some image or being an image of the. I'm being confused now, but yeah, exactly what you can.
Yeah, I'm going to just read. I'm just going to read some of the chunks here, but so this is like connecting to different things. But Judd has tacitly confused the novel with the radical. Burn. He implies that any vacuum form plexibas relief is automatically superior to any contemporary ideated marks on a flat surface. But ideas are ideas. Techniques and materials are not ideas. Ideas and materials have a functional relationship, not an identity. If oil on canvas did confer a familiar quality, especially identified with art, there are those who would count this as an special virtue of the materials that is not new, aesthetic value served in an arrangement of lamps anywhere but the ceiling, or in mirror cubes confounded with modern tables. Duchamp's early question put and answered what is art, and his catechesis is still sufficient. Non-art settings, sites, and positions per se are not innovations in art. Those works which do depend on the unfamiliar require intensive propaganda to establish and maintain the small art quality in their amalgam. The printer then provides the familiar quality, especially identified with art. I think there's something really interesting, and she'll come to this in like different ways, but like this idea that, you know, that those materials that minimalists are using can be pure and see outside of any sort of like connotation, but also, and it goes again to this idea of maintenance, it's like the work that the text and the contextualization and the narrative that exists around the work is doing is so strong. And I think there's something about calling that out as well, in terms of like the stuff that maintains the artwork on the outside, and saying like, well, for you to like have this pretense that these are just like random materials that have no meaning, you have to create such an insane theoretical and like PR scaffolding around it. And I'm not saying I'm still really interested in the work, but that sort of makes me more interested. It's almost like her reading of minimalism made me more interested in minimalism than I was before, because I think she identified lots of really interesting strategies that are going there now that I think Morris and Jude at that time are negating.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating there is, and this is again something I wanted to say earlier for students, when things seem contradictory or somehow like unsummarizable or unput back togetherable, that's when you should plow on. That's not when you should give up or try and make a neat conclusion. And I think, you know, this is a really good example with minimalism where minimalism, the name implies this kind of like slimmed down, pared down set of materials or choices or forms or something. But all of that does require all of this additional work by the artist who becomes the critic. And it's not my idea. This is like the historicization of that time period is about these things being in parallel. Like the power of the critic kind of dissipates slightly and the artist kind of starts writing, which is why all this stuff's happening in the pages of Artforum, because all these artists start writing, not like about work, but like as part of the theoretical or philosophical scaffolding to make their work possible. But yeah, obviously, you know, Jo Baer is pointing out that like some of the claims they're making are contradicted by the fact that they're having to make them both in writing and in material form. But again, I don't think that's like it. I think it's just a really good angle on minimalism rather than a dismissal of it.
Oh yeah, 100%, yeah.
And I think her point is basically that painting can do this stuff, and it does do this stuff really well. And that the fact that it's a known quantity, as in oil and canvas, is known to be related to art is neither here nor there. She says, it's just before your quote, oil and canvas are no more or less identified with art than tempera and board, flux and porcelain, ink or watercolor and paper, colored earths and granite, colored glass and mullions, pigments and sandstone, lacquer and metal, acrylic and plexi. We paint a house with oil and shade its windows with canvas. So the point being that, I mean, again, I think it's a bit of a laboured point, because I think oil and canvas are connected with art in a way that like plexiglass maybe wasn't. But the point being that like as soon as you connect these things with art, they will be connected with art. And as soon as you put them in the context of art, they will be understood through that lens anyway.
It's really interesting. Like this podcast is changing my relation to painting so much, I think. And there's something about this like defense of the potential of painting, like what painting can do that nothing else can do, or what painting can do. And there's something about like Baer's defense of like, and it's very specific of its time, right? Because I think those dynamics are changing, but that painting has been a place where like radical thought in the arts have existed for so long, and sculpture is trying to, take a claim and say like, no, we are where like radical thinking is happening. And what Baer is saying in a sense is like, for you to be able to do that, you have to rely on ignorance of what painting has done in the past 100 years or something, or even like 30 years. So she has all these kind of like things when she's calling out Judd, Judd says something and she's like, but just look at like this, painting like 10 years ago doing this. Like, why are you saying this is something that sculpture can do? So she has this thing that is coming from like responding specifically from Judd. It's a really long paragraph, but I feel it's hard to cut it out. So I'm just going to read a big chunk. Radical painting completed this specific endeavor in the 30s. It began in 1908. Jude's own specific objective has been the arrangement of cubes and our parallel Papillon in or on a shallow space. And though he specifies arrangements which emphasize unity and wholeness of the objects, paintings or sculpture, this later qualification was also invented by painters and is also much prior to any art or paper by Judd. 58 to 63, Jasper Johns, Frank Stella, Nolan. As the exhaustion of cubist concerns in paintings is hardly news, their translation now into specific objects is at best a minor sport. For about 100 years, painting has demonstrated the precursive radical ideas in art. Painting is best suited for this pursuit, and the best painters are still about it. It is no surprise, however, that an academic sculptural sensibility is not able to anticipate these new ideas. Burn again. Arrangements which emphasize the rectangle is not one of them.
I think that's the biggest burn, because they emphasize the rectangle as in quotes.
So good. So I just recommend
we'll
put this in.
Emphasizing the rectangle, are you? Oh, well done.
I just think everybody should read all this essay. Like, not the essay, it's like a 3-page letter, but it's just, I think especially, if you're someone who does painting, who's like feeling pushed to do other, and I'm saying this as someone who lives in that tension, which I'm always like questioning my students, why are you painting? Because I think a lot of students go into painting because that is just a natural progression from like A levels and what they think art is. But there is like painting has so much force. And I think there's something about like learning to understand why you're making that choice. And if you're making that choice because of your relationship with painting, then I think this is an incredible text to like, feel the kind of the power of this argument for painting and the place of painting in the world that is completely outside of like, commercial art concerns or things like that. It's like a painting as a very specific way that allows for a very specific type of thinking and practice and questioning.
Just to kind of push that a bit further as well, I think to go back to Lozano, is that what's fascinating, right, is that, if you look at the summary of her life, you look at painting and then you look at these art life pieces, which kind of start to become really difficult and produce loads of problems in her life. But actually, through doing this reading, painting is causing her just as many issues, like psychologically, bodily, like it's really hard. And what she's doing with painting is like, I don't know, just as radical in that sense of that kind of 1960s, like throwing your whole self into. It's not comfortable. That's what I mean. Painting is not comfortable at all, not literally and not metaphorically. And that's what's really fascinating about the practice is like, painting is so often positioned as like this comfortable, like, oh, you just want to paint, you want to go the easy route. But Lozano kind of shows, and Jo Baer points out in that letter, it's not really an easy route, and it doesn't have to be an easy route. The reason that painting was so important to the development of modern art is because lots of painters weren't doing easy things. They were doing really difficult.
And it goes back to that idea, which I really love, about like what cannot be, what is it you constructed that cannot be captured by reproduction or by language. And I think that's one of the things when we started this series that really fascinates me about painting, because I think painting is a space where you're always, and this is what was hard to prepare for this show, is like you're always like hitting this point where like there's a thinking and that can only happen through process and through image making and through the material object that cannot be articulated in any other way. And I think that's, to me, is still like the thing that fascinates me the most about painting. Just before, so for us to go back to Lozano, but Lozano has a statement for a catalog for a painting show. It's in one of the, so it's in a different book, but maybe we can put like a PDF to it.
Yeah.
So it's really short, but it's her like it's a defense of painting. So she has lots of like, as I understand, you read the notebook more than I, but she has like moments when she hates painting, when she loves painting, when she's defending painting, when she's like taking painting apart. So Lee Lozano, statement for catalog, painting show, October 69, Wheaton College, Massachusetts. What is the relevance of painting, I am asked. This is the sort of question I might discuss in a dialogue, if the other person were interested. Asking a question in a dialogue produces more questions. Each time I ask myself this question, which is often recently, it gets answered by my producing a painting. Questions are for speaking, answers are for doing. Terseness is for writing.
Yeah, nice.
I really love that. I think there's something about, because you can see that in her work, like her thinking in the notes is all about like questioning. And then the practice is all about trying to like find her way around those, not that you get an answer, but you kind of like trying to find your way around those questions. And that kind of like relationship between like making and thinking is so present, in which like the making is not an illustration of the thinking, but the making is like the process of exploring the thinking, if that makes sense.
That's why the notebooks are really fascinating for me. I think partly because there's such a weird mixture of like totally prosaic, almost like spiritually philosophical, and kind of a bit mad sometimes, just like, you know, leaning into like totally personal, intuitive, or like semi-jokey positions being taken on. They're really fascinating, I think. And they're actually, I don't know if they're just a really good illustration of like what can be written down when you're trying to make something. Like what can actually be, what notes you can actually take. Like it's not about a meaning. It's not about,
it's not an explanation. It's never an explanation.
It's not an explanation. No, not at all. But it's a document of what can be documented while you're trying to do something, while you're trying to make something. In terms of lots of all these little drawings and all these little notes, and the way that time kind of builds up. Like she goes back to previous pages in the notebooks to like re-annotate drawings or thoughts that she had, you know, a week earlier or whatever, and kind of updates them or reflects on them or dismisses her previous ideas. And that is just, super interesting because it's such a basic form as well. It's just a notebook that she, I guess, kept with her, like lots and lots of people do. Like you have your little book and you keep your notes in it and stuff. But just it becomes like such a brilliant way to like get to the practice. And actually you were talking about the Wave series is particularly hard to look at in reproduction because it's metallic paint and it's lit. So all the images of it are have different lighting because when there's close-ups and the camera's in a different position, the different parts of the paint are like shining in different ways and stuff. So in a way, it's just like we're not really looking at the paintings at all. But in another way, like Lozano, a bit like Gaston, Felida Barlow for me, actually, it's one of those artists who, when I see their work in reproduction, I really get like a churning feeling in my stomach of like wanting to like look at it really closely. Like reminds me of being a kid and like wanting to look at in detail at like a crazy drawing or something, like just wanting to like touch it but not, I don't know, with your mind or something. It's, I love it. I just want to say it's weird how like that's the case with all of the work from the early, like, you know, scratchy drawings of boobs and penises and stuff through to the Tool series and to the Wave series. Even though they look totally different, they still kind of get me in the same way. And that's kind of weird. A bit like us.
Maybe I have some little bits because then she gets to the actual Wave series. So I had like some little bits of like the description of just like material choices and stuff like that. So maybe I'll just read a little bit of paragraphs and then we can kind of like talk about that. But so this is from Applin. Basing the Wave series on the electromagnetic spectrum meant Lozano had a preset system with which to work, but also subvert, mapping on it her own set of rules. Lozano chose to make them using soon-to-expire Shiva brand of iron oxide oil paints, which she applied to the stretched sheets of duck canvas that she had already prepared with 2 coats of glue and 2 coats of lead white paint. Aware that the brand was being discontinued, Lozano considered stopping the series when supplies ran out. Although cheap, Shiva paintings were unpopular.
I just stopped you there. However, I think that's the best quote in the whole piece. Although cheap, Shiva paints weren't popular. What a combo. Yeah, they're cheap and they're very unpopular.
Yeah, but I found like I don't know if the notes that you sent, but like at some point she's writing about it because she's like, everybody thinks these paints are crap, but I like them. They have these qualities and I'm standing for them. Says that for Lozano, however, it was precisely the heavy quality that others disliked that drew her to the brand in the first place, and the fact that the colors had what she called a quality of science to them, even though at one point she also contemplated using reflective traffic paint. The entire series looks somehow backlit, an effect produced by the spotlights bouncing off the white undercoat and striated surface of each painting. The result is surfaces that refuse to fix and settle, and instead, like the energy waves, they mimic, vibrate, and hum. Making the waves paintings was hard work. Each was produced over the course of one sitting. Lozano later recollected that the more waves, the longer it took to do them. I was awake almost all the time it took. The last one in the series took the longest, 52 hours. The oscillations were high energy. For Lozano, the aim was to register energy on the painting surface, including the physical exertion each work demanded. Given the set of strict self-imposed rules according to which Lozano made the series, it is hard not to think of them in physical bodily terms despite their ostensible abstraction. Because part of the process of making each painting involved Lozano abstaining from food, staying awake, or pushing herself to paint for the duration in other physical demanding states. I paint stone, she wrote in 1969, next to a series of notes about the Wave series. Elsewhere, Lozano considered placing other kinds of restrictions on the production of the paintings, proposing to paint only when tired, horny, sick, in love, etc. In this context, the wave paintings can be considered less as an alternative than a correlate of the art life conceptual works that Lozano was started doing. Her body again became her main tool, not as an extension, but rather as a substitute for the paintbrush and canvas.
Yeah, great.
It goes back to like how to talk about these things, right? And there's something about like what Lozano chooses to do for the press release of the Wave Show, which is like to describe how they're made. That for her in the press release, she talks about like the time it took to make, or like the choice of paint, like the choice of how they're hung. And I think there's something in this so much about this series about us or me trying to figure out how to talk about painting, how to look at painting. And there's something about this kind of like really paying attention to those things, paying attention to the choice of painting, paying attention to the way, the types of brushes are used and how they're used, and the rhythm of the painting and the body in the painting. And I don't know, it's like it's changing. That's what I mean, that it's changing the way I look about painting, because it's changing my attention to painting. Well, before I used to just see a surface. Now there's all this richness of the history of how this thing is constructed and the choices and the kind of materiality of it that I think was not necessarily that present to me before.
I mean, I think I'm looking now, you sent through the Lee Lozano's adapted Whitney press release. And I'm not sure if this ends up being the actual press release or if she just made these notes to signal her displeasure with it. They're saying things like the repetitive curves of pulsating sound become a theme. She crosses that out and she says, the medium, oil paint, the principle, what happens when waves of paint get shorter and shallower, the method, use the same brush for each wavelength and paint each wave area in one session. The brush, 3-inch width house paint bristle, brackets mellow. It's just so funny because it's like, in a way, they both obviously don't get anywhere close to the what it's like to look at the paintings. But at least with her one, it describes something that definitely exists, in the sense that all of that stuff is true about the kind of paint that she's using, the brush that she's using. And so it does make you think about the kind of like language that we use to get to support our experience of viewing paint, or to view any artworks really. But her that would be her press release would be rubbish as well. Like thinking, oh yeah, there you go. At the bottom, she makes this table, which tells you like handling the series, the number of waves, the wavelength, the length of painting session, the date finish, the color, as though that would be like, oh yeah, we'll put that on the press release. We'll have like a table, like an Excel spreadsheet in the press release. Maybe it should have been. I don't know.
But think again about it. This is the show that that has the kind of the weird room, that has the plastic box and stuff that doesn't get. Also, press release completely ignore it. Like that work is not there. The Whitney is like very quietly like pretending that room is not there.
But she doesn't make a note. I'm fascinated by that because that's something I would do. I'd get my big charts of my big masterpiece, and I'd be like, "We're so excited about the masterpiece." I'd be like, "Yes. By the way, along with the masterpiece, I want to exhibit my shitty underpants or whatever it is." And they'd be like, "But the masterpiece," and I'd be like, "Yes, the masterpiece plus the toenails." Or whatever. I really empathize with Lozano's choice, but she doesn't even mention it in this press release. I'm gonna look into that because that seems fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also it's interesting. It's like this moment of like you said, this moment of clash of who gets to contextualize their work, who gets to say, what are the parameters through which you encounter the work, and you can see that tension between her and the Whitney, right? Like she has a very specific way to contextualize the work, and the Whitney is like, no, we have to think of it. This is a very specific moment, and Lozano is showing in this moment when there's this whole protest of feminist artists because the Whitney doesn't show enough female artists, and the curator, who's a woman, is saying well, we're showing Lozano and we show these people. So it's a very symbolically has such an important moment in which they have to prove that women artists can do this very sophisticated stuff, and they can be seen, and to be part of that sophisticated stuff means to be sold in that sort of art language, that kind of I don't know, it's so addictive. I do this all the time when I have to write about art statement, even though last year we looked at Sangan and Goody who also does amazing artist statements, and it's like, oh yeah, you can just write from you, but once you're in that context, it's so hard to do that because everybody around you is writing about the work in this using these like words and theory words and stuff like that. So I think it's a really interesting document of that tension, and how hard it is to be the voice that contextualize your own work once you're in an institutional setting. Like,
well, I'm aware we're coming up to time now. Do you want to talk about the last part of the essay, Applin's essay, which kind of tries to do this thing with feminism and what she calls it abstraction, or is that too much?
There's like two things that I think I would rather go to.
Okay.
One is maybe like to read the short description of the small room next to the paintings.
Oh yeah. What page is that on? Just 'cause I want to
That's
see
page
that.
91. Applin is really interesting. So Applin is mapping like 2 or 3 critics that have written about Baer, the Wave series, and these other abstract artists that kind of like are in the same moment. And she's looking at the words. So for example, like illusionism is a critique that comes all the time, but also things like there's a lot. There's a really interesting comparison about like what's the language that people are using, how they're talking about it, and why those critics like basically hated or like were very not hated. They spent a lot of time with the work, but they didn't like the work basically. In her review of the Wave series, Linville noted 2 other curious points of information about Lozano's show. The first was the fact that located in a second room of the main gallery was a small group of plastic boxes containing body hair, nail clippings, and birthstones. Linville ultimately dismissed these boxes as the final straw in a show that amounted to little more than an intense private trip for the artist that failed to transfer to the viewer. She wondered whether this room was meant to represent an identity image for the artist, or perhaps a self-portrait or rejoinder even to the esoteric abstraction of the main gallery. Perrault was less perturbed than Linville in his brief account of the show in the Village Voice, simply noting that alongside the elegantly hung Wave series, Lozano had included a set of preparatory drawings and a small box containing nail clippings and hair. Such was the apparent disjuncture between the contents of the 2 galleries that Solomon later recalled not the actual Wave paintings, but only the room containing what she remembers as a bag of fingernails, cuticles, toenails, hair from various body parts. I just love as well, like, that kind of like this different like narration of what are the things that shock the painters, that people remind that someone would like go to the show of the Wave paintings and they'd be like, I don't remember the Wave paintings at all. I just remember this really weird room with a bag of fingernails.
But that speaks a little bit to Jo Baer's letter back to Jada Morris, right? Of like what is remembered for that time and what is in a way canonized at that time is the novel. Or like things that are entering into art that people are saying, by the way, this hasn't been done before. And in a way that it speaks to a kind of metaphysics of attention about what gets remembered or what is notable because it's different or kind of stands out from the background or something like that. And I think that's why the first way I encountered Lozano was through, the Dropout piece, because that was in the 2010s or whatever, that's where I kind of started noticing it being written about as this kind of Bartleby refusal thing, right? Which the paintings are kind of doing a similar thing, but in a much more like integrated or like nuanced way. Because, the Wave series is entitled Endurance Painting. It's titled the Wave series. It's like named as though what you see on the surface of the paintings is utterly, abstract or something, when in fact it's, once we've now dug into it, it's just as kind of fascinating in its attempts to combine bodily experience with image making, with process. And I think it just speaks to the way that contemporary art is constructed. It is constructed in novelty. It's constructed on a series of people doing things that they kind of claim that someone hasn't done before. And the Wave series just doesn't need that claim to be looked at. Whereas Dropout piece, the reason it gets written about a lot is because it does feel unique in some way, or at least very, very.
I'm just gonna follow that with like there's like a tiny bit of a paragraph again. So Applin goes for a few pages on this thing, but they're on trying to like understand this. But I think there's something really interesting about like failure and excess that will come to this, and then the last part. But so one of the other things that are in that small room that don't get talk about this is there's a failed Wave painting, and there's a failed Wave painting that you can touch, because that was something that she was really interested that people could touch the paintings. So this is about after she's talking about this for a bit. So I think it is important in this context that Lozano elected to show an example of a failed wave, engaging viewers less in a mesmeric spectacle than in a two-way dialogue. In fact, Lozano said she initially intended the wave series to be handled and had encouraged viewers to touch the discarded version of Six Wave as it hung next to the equally tactile, if rather more abject, box of piles of hair and nail clippings. Rather than a short-circuit failure, we can think of Lozano's second gallery as a kind of repository containing the excess of the series, with Lozano's working outs, plotting and planning on paper exhibit side by side with the material failures and discarded remnants that Lozano produced at the same time, from paintings that went wrong to nails that had been clipped and pubic hairs shed. Perhaps what Lozano intended with her room of addenda was a figuration of failure as a kind of surplus already built into the system. And that goes to like those things about like maintenance and kind of this kind of interest in what is the internal procedures of painting, and that the internal procedures of painting involve these externalities as well and involve the failure. And I think there's a choice, right? Whenever because she just shows the notebooks and stuff. So she's always displaying her failure in a sense, like the failure is part of the work. Like I just wanted to finish because I was really interested in this kind of idea of failure, especially in terms of teaching. And I'm teaching a lot of painters now. And I keep saying, like, this week I've said to a lot of people, like, the only way to learn how to make paintings is to do a lot of bad paintings. Like, you have to keep crossing that line over and over until you like understand where those lines in. So I just wanted maybe like for a last thing and kind of connecting to that idea of failure. There's Agnes Martin, which is someone who is working at a bit earlier, but a similar time to Lozano, and that also quit the New York art scene. We seem to be winning, and so Martin held no truck with notions of success or failure in painting or working. We seem to be winning and losing, but in reality there is no losing, she wrote in 1972. Perfection, Martin noted, is never an option, even if it's the thing to which all artists aspire. Inspiration is simply the guide to the next thing and might be what we call success or failure. The bad paintings have to be painted, and to the artists these are more valuable than those paintings later brought before the public. And I love that. I love this. The bad paintings have to be painted. And to the artists, these are more valuable than those paintings later brought before to the public.
And it makes me think, I've been thinking a lot recently about what is the value of teaching art and so on. And I think more and more, I think I was listening to a podcast with Ty Shiner the other day, and she was talking about kind of the romantic idea of being a kind of servant to art, or dedicating your life to art, or even kind of giving up your life to art. And she wasn't endorsing that. She was saying it's something she found kind of romantic when she was a teenager. And I was just thinking, well, art is the thing that makes it possible for me to like live, not literally live, but like, get on in this world. Like all my favorite artists are people who've found practices that allow them to carry on doing stuff. And part of what's being carried on is like carry on making art. Like I think that's what's really funny about the idea of success or failure, because like perfection hovers there in the background as though you could finish art or something. You could like satisfy yourself with art, but the ongoingness of it is kind of exactly, as far as I can tell, the thing that's most important to it. And that requires failure. It doesn't really thrive on success. Like the ongoingness of art is much more easily fueled by like partial failure. And Lozano's whole career was full of documents or really amazing moments where it's like kind of all works out amazingly, but there's also this confusion or complexity around it. Or in the Wave series, and that separate room is so great. But it's great. I mean, she's so great. And I think even in reproduction, maybe not the Wave series so much, but all the other pieces are really like, they get you. Welcome back. Thank you so much for listening. That was a great episode. I love Lee Lozano, as maybe is pretty obvious from that episode. Thanks to Andrea for talking to me as per, and we will be back soonish with another episode. One final thing before I go. I'm recording this in end of November 2025. So, if you're listening to this like 10 years later, then don't worry too much about this part of it. But we've got a few invites to travel around different places outside of the UK next year to record live episodes of the podcast. And I thought it would be fun to try and make 2026 the year of the 10 Texts World Tour. So if you are living, well, it could be in the UK as well, right? You can have part of your world tour could be at home. If you work at a university or a gallery or some other kind of institution which would be interested in hosting a live edition of the 10 Text podcast, we can either respond to an exhibition that you've got up, or we can, do a special episode of 10 Text on painting or sculpture or some other art form. Whatever you fancy, really. It just seems fun to try and do these live and take the podcast out on the road. Okay, I hope you enjoy this episode. And yeah, like I said, we'll be back soon with another one. Bye.